Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Reading Club. And tonight we are reading Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And we read the introduction and the foreword. And this is a book that you want to read the introduction and the foreword because it is just that good. Uh, by Coretta Scott King does her portion, and then we have another portion uh, by a person that was really instrumental to Dr. King and came to visit Las Vegas, came to visit quite often, named Vincent Harding. So, please read the introduction and the forward like we did. Tonight, we're starting on Chapter-1, which is titled, Where Are We? And that's on page 1. I'll start off reading, and at any time as I read, if someone would like to comment, wait till we get to a period and, end of a sentence or paragraph, and then chime in. For those who are getting this through social media, just go ahead and leave your whatever you'd like to say in the comments section. So once again, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community by Martin Luther King on page 1, chapter 1, titled, Where Are We? On August 6, 1965, the President's Room of the Capitol could scarcely hold the multitude of white and Negro leaders crowding it. President Lyndon Johnson's high spirits were marked as he circulated among the many guests whom he had invited to witness an event he confidently felt to be historic, the signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The legislation was designed to put the ballot effectively into Negro hands in the South after a century of denial by terror and evasion. If you didn't know better, you was thinking they're talking about today. The bill that lay on the polished mahogany desk was born in violence in Selma, Alabama, where a stubborn sheriff handling Negroes in the Southern tradition, had stumbled against the future. During a nonviolent demonstration for voting rights, the sheriff had directed his men in tear gassing and beating the marchers to the ground. In protest, Negroes and whites marched 50 miles through Alabama and arrived at the state capital of Montgomery in a demonstration 50,000 strong. President Johnson, describing Selma as a modern Concord, addressed a joint session of Congress before a television audience of millions. He pledged that, quote, we shall overcome, close quote, and declared that the nation must by law ensure every Negro his full rights as citizen. This was 1965. I was a little boy, obviously not voting age, but there was no real voting age for me because I didn't have this right. So even though I was born in this country, and I've often said this, did not have full citizenship rights. 1965. In signing the measure, the president announced that, quote, today is a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield, close quote. Today we strike away the last major shackle of fierce and ancient bonds, close quote. 1 year later, some of the people who had been brutalized in Selma and who were present at the Capitol ceremonies were leading marches in the suburbs of Chicago amid a rain of rocks and bottles among burning automobiles to the thunder of jeering thousands, many of them waving Nazi flags. Does this sound like
I know, right?
back then, or does it sound more like right now? And notice the violence of these people, not the protesters. This is the violence of white Americans. I continue to read, and they're waving Nazi flags. A year later, some of the Negro leaders who had been present in Selma and at the Capitol ceremonies no longer held office in their organizations. They had been discarded to symbolize a radical change of tactics. A year later, the white backlash had become an emotional electoral issue in California, Maryland, and elsewhere. In several southern states, men long regarded as political clowns had become governors or only narrowly missed election. Their magic achieved with a quote, witches, close quote, brew of bigotry, prejudice, half truths, and whole lies. I'm going to stop right there. Remember, we're talking about 1965. But does it sound like 2021?
It does. 100%.
Isn't that? That's why this book is so important to read now. I continue. During the year, white and Negro civil rights workers had been murdered in several southern communities. Remember, it's not about hate, it's about a culture. I'm being facetious. I continue to read. The swift and easy acquittal that followed for the accused had shocked much of the nation, but sent a wave of unabashed triumph through Southern segregationist circles. I gotta stop again. Does this remind you of when police officers kill an unarmed person, oftentimes black, and get away with it? You know, a lot of people say things haven't changed. Things definitely have changed. But as much as things have changed, some things have stayed the same. White supremacy, racism, prejudice, white hate, white violence against non-white people and particularly black people. It was present then, and it's displayed itself pretty much the same way then as it displays itself today. I continue to read. Many of us wept at the funeral services for the dead and for democracy. During this year, in several northern and western cities, most tragically in Watts, young Negroes had exploded in violence. In an irrational burst of rage, they had sought to say something, but the flames had blackened both themselves and their oppressors. A year later, Ramparts magazine was asserting, quote, after more than a decade of the civil rights movement, the Black America in Harlem, Haynesville, Baltimore, and Bogalusa is worse off today than it was 10 years ago. The movement's leaders know it, and it's the source of their despair. The movement is in despair because it has been forced to recognize that Negro revolution as a myth, close quote. Had Negroes fumbled...
Ouch, that hurts. That hurts.
Well, so I say go to any major metropolitan city, and it's a good possibility that the worst places in that city are places where black people live and where there was some type of violent activity, whether it was 10 years ago, 30 years ago with Rodney King, 40 years ago with riots in New York, or when Dr. King was assassinated in 68. It doesn't make a difference. Go to Chicago, go to New York, pick one. And either those places are the worst places in town, or they have been gentrified where black people don't live anymore. And you can see a lot of that in places like New York, the Bay Area.
Yeah, I think he's talking about the disappointment, your illusions crash after all the achievement they had in the first place, and now it seems like everything has vanished.
There's definitely some truth to that, but then you have to get to the root cause of the why. And when you dig into the why, you find that it often has something to do with what we just read about, and that's violence of white people directed towards black people. And eventually, these black people, their emotions erupted, just like he said, exploded, and led to more despair in their communities. And what we found is that there's a cycle of this in the communities. Roughly every 15 to 20 years, uh, it's like it explodes. They get it out of their system, and then over time,
Comes back.
the oppression, violence builds it back up, and then it erupts again. And every time the community seems to be on its way to improvement, it has to start all over again. Well, the rest of the country is moving forward. So every time we have to start over again, it's really a step backwards.
Yes.
I continue to read. Had Negroes fumbled the opportunities described by the president? Was the movement in despair? Why was widespread sympathy with the Negro Revolution abruptly submerged in indifference in some quarters or banished by outright hostility in others? Why was there ideological disarray? A simple explanation holds that Negroes rioted in Watts. The voice of Black power was heard through the land, and the white backlash was born. The public became infuriated, and sympathy evaporated. This pat explanation founders, however, on the hard fact that the change in mood had preceded Watts and the Black Power slogan. Moreover, the white backlash had always existed underneath and sometimes on the surface of American life. No, the answers are both more complex and, for the long haul, less pessimistic. Less pessimistic. With Selma and the Voting Rights Act, one phase of development in the Civil Rights Revolution came to an end. A new phase opened up, but few observers realized it or were prepared for its implications. For the vast majority of white Americans the past decade, the first phase had been a struggle to treat the Negro with a degree of decency, not of equality. White America was ready to demand that the Negro should be spared the lash of brutality and coarse degradation, but it had never been truly committed to helping him out of poverty, exploitation, or all forms of discrimination. The outrage white citizens had been sincere when he snatched the whips from the Southern sheriffs and forbade them more cruelties. But when this was to a degree accomplished, the emotions that had momentarily inflamed him melted away. White Americans left the Negro on the ground and in devastating numbers walked off with the aggressor. It appeared that the white segregationist and the ordinary white citizen had more in common with one another than either had with the Negro. When Negroes looked for the second phase, the realization of equality, they found that many of their white allies had quietly disappeared. The Negroes of America had taken the president, the press, and the pulpit at their word when they spoke in broad terms of freedom and justice. But the absence of brutality had unregenerate evil is not the presence of justice. To stay murder is not the same thing as to ordain brotherhood. The word was broken, and in free running expectations of the Negro crashed into the stone walls of white resistance. The result was havoc. Negroes felt cheated, especially in the North, while many whites felt that the Negro had gained so much it was virtually impudent and greedy to ask for more so soon. So if you get what you should have, and you should have even more, you shouldn't ask for it because it might seem like you're getting too much. I continue to read. The paths of Negro-white unity that had been converging crossed at Selma, and like a giant X began to diverge. Up to Selma, there had been unity to eliminate barbaric conduct. Beyond it, the unity had to be based on the fulfillment of equality. And in the absence of agreement, the paths began to inexorably to move apart. Section 2. Does anyone else want to pick up reading in Section 2? I just read Section 1.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. I think these last two paragraphs, they really summarize the topic of the book, or at least they connect to the title, right? To where do we go from here? He here is saying, now the stakes were not just, it seems like We Can Wait was more about, Why We Can Wait was more about have allies against brutal treatment. But now it opens up a completely different thing, and that's why he asked, where do we go from here? This is the different scenario, and we need a new pact, a new alliance with our people who could be allies, because now we are fighting for a different thing. I think these two paragraphs for me were very good. I understand what he's going, where is he going with this book, I think.
You know, it almost seems like it was easier to pass a law for a thing, whether we're talking about the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. So you pass the law, and that's on paper and that's words. But then it comes to the action, the work, and that's where things, you know, from a historical perspective, and especially with what's going on in modern day America, we can see that actually passing the laws turned out to be the easiest part. 1965, this is 2021, and
but it's not. It's not just the law, Rodney. I think he's saying there was a consensus to treat Black African Americans with dignity, or with more dignity. But there was not a consensus in the American society to treat them as equals. And that's when there is a gap between what happened first and was expected to happen next. So I understand your point about the law, but I think I kind of I focus in a different idea, the idea that there were not really real consensus about create the conditions to go for equality. Like most of the American public didn't really, they were not cool with creating the conditions for equality. They were cool with, oh yes, they shouldn't be mistreated.
Anybody else
Right?
want to jump in on that before we continue to read?
I agree. I think that we won't feed our animals or mistreat our animals anymore, but they are still not.
They're still animals.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I tell you what. I'll go ahead and read section 2. I continue to read. Why is equality so assiduously avoided? Why does white America delude itself, and how does it rationalize the evil it retains? The majority of white Americans consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro. They believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and to steady growth towards a middle class, utopia embodying racial harmony. But unfortunately, this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity. Overwhelmingly, America is still struggling with irresolution and contradictions. It has been sincere and even ardent in welcoming some change, but too quickly apathy and disinterest rise to the surface when the next logical steps are to be taken. Laws are passed in a crisis mood after a Birmingham or a Selma, but no substantial fervor survives the formal signing of legislation. The recording of the law in itself is treated as the reality of the reform. So in other words, hey, we got the law. We can all go home. Everything is better. I continue to read. This limited degree of concern is a reflection of an inner conflict which measures cautiously the impact of any change on the status quo. As the nation passes from opposing extremist behavior to the deeper and more pervasive elements of equality, white America reaffirms its bonds to the status quo. It had contemplated comfortably hugging the shoreline, but now fears that the winds of change are blowing it out to sea. So people who were middle-aged in 1965, Waddell, how old would they be now? So let's say they were 35 in 65. That was what, roughly 45 years ago? 55 years ago? So those people...
I'm sorry, my mic was off, so yes, you got that right.
So those people are, they're still on the scene, but they're not maybe the dominant group. So that would mean that this has sort of gone to the next generation and maybe the generation after that. So we can see that this concept is multi-generational and has not disappeared with time. It's amazing. This limited degree of concern is a reflection of an inner conflict which measures cautiously the impact of any change on the status quo as the nation passes from opposing extremist behavior. So I wanted to talk about that extremist behavior, because has it ever passed extremist behavior? What's the number one issue in America today when it comes to violence? It's extremist behavior of white supremacists and white supremacist organizations. 2021, not 1965. As the nation passes from opposing extremist behavior to the deeper and more pervasive elements of equality, white America reaffirms its bonds to the status quo. It had contemplated comfortably hugging the shoreline, but now fears that the winds of change are blowing it out to sea. I continue to read. The practical cost of change for the nation up to this point has been cheap. The limited reforms have been obtained at bargain rates. There are no expenses and no taxes are required for Negroes to share lunch counters, libraries, parks, hotels, and other facilities with whites. Even the psychological adjustment is far from formidable. Having exaggerated the emotional difficulties for decades, when demands for new conduct became inescapable, white Southerners may have trembled under the strain, but they did not collapse. Even the more significant changes involved in voter registration required neither large monetary nor psychological sacrifice. Speculator and turbulent events that dramatized the demands created an erroneous impression that a heavy burden was involved. The real cost lies ahead. The stiffening of white resistance is a recognition of that fact. The discount education given Negroes will in the future have to be purchased at full price if quality education is to be realized. Jobs are harder and costlier to create than voting rolls. The eradication of slums housing millions is complex, far beyond integrating buses and lunch counters. The assistant director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, Hyman Bookbinder, in a frank statement on December 29, 1966, declared that the long-range cause of inequality, implementing programs to fight poverty, ignorance, and slums will reach $1 trillion. $1 trillion. He was not awed or dismayed by this prospect, but instead pointed out that the growth of the gross national product during the same period makes this expenditure comfortably possible. It is, he said, as simple as this, quote, the poor can stop being poor if the rich are willing to become even richer at a slower rate, close quote. Furthermore, he predicted that unless a, quote, substantial sacrifice is made by the American people, close quote, the nation can expect further deterioration of the cities, increased antagonism between races, and continual disorders in the street. He asserted that people are not informed enough to give adequate support to anti-poverty programs, and he leveled the share of the blame at the government because it, quote, must do more to get people to understand the size of the problem, close quote. Can we talk about that section just a little bit? Because he said that it was going to cost $1 trillion, but he also said that the money would be there for it.
Right.
But we acted like the money wasn't, and we didn't actually spend the money for it. So then there's a certain level of saying, hey, we wasted spending money, and look, we didn't get the outcome. But they didn't spend the money that it took to get the outcome that was desired, and then they blamed the money that they did spend for not doing what it never was scheduled to do. I just find that that's ironic.
This was the assistant director of the office. It was for Lyndon, Johnson Lyndon.
That was during the Johnson presidency.
Okay.
So even now, the government wants to pass laws and implement programs, but we still don't have that educational background to get people to go along with, get that critical mass. And General's only 29. She doesn't probably remember. Every night on the television, we had public service announcements for whatever was trying to accomplish at the time. And I have not seen one of those, and I can't remember when. But we had them for anti-smoking. We had them for, and I was a little young to see some of the racial equality, but still, those programs were out there, and there were some town hall meetings, things of that nature, but we don't have that education of the nation anymore. As a matter of fact, our politicians, I think it was mentioned in the book earlier, people who were political clowns are now in power, and they are trying to desperately keep that education from happening. So, yes, it's timely, and it has also not changed because we still don't do enough to accomplish the goals that we want to, because everyone is so afraid that they're going to have to burden all.
And it seems like the clowns, there are more clowns, and they're willing to clown more in public than ever before. Whether we're talking about Josh Hawley, whether we're talking about Ted Cruz, whether we're talking about John Kennedy, I think from someplace in the South, maybe Louisiana, or whether we're talking about Gomer, whether we're talking about Jim Jordan. I mean, actually, there's a long list of clowns today. And they're behaving just as predicted, just as Dr. King is stating in this book. And here's a statement that got me. He says, the poor can stop being poor if the rich are willing to become even richer at a slower rate. That's a quote.
Yes.
Now, he didn't say the rich stop being rich. He didn't say take the money from the rich. That's not what he said. He just says, hey, be rich and get richer. But in order for the poor to stop being poor, you just don't get rich quite as fast. And the reason why I wanted to point that out was because I think in the last quarter, some of the richest people on the planet who are Americans, whether we're talking about Jeff Bezos, whether we're talking about Elon Musk, who he and Jeff Bezos is going back and forth, and who's going to be the richest person in the world. You can throw in the Microsoft guy, whose name escapes me right now.
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates. Right. The Facebook guy, Mark Zuckerberg. These people, I think Jeff Bezos made $30 billion in a quarter, and actually less than a quarter. So in less than 3 months, on average, he was making $10 billion a month. Look at the scale of the amount of money that not only the richest have, but how much they're making, but more importantly, how quick they are making it. And as they are doing this, at the same time, there's an argument that we shouldn't pay people more than $8.25 an hour on the minimum wage. Those two things cannot exist to bring equality back, not just for the Negro, but when we start talking about class, for the poor, because there's a finite amount of money. And if the richest, 0.1% is sucking that money up at a rate of $10 billion a month, not a year, not a lifetime, a month, it just seems unsustainable. Because at that rate, we could say that Jeff Bezos theoretically could make $120 billion in a year, when it was just a couple of years ago that anybody even possessed $100 billion. And so it took all of this time to generate wealth in a single individual of $100 billion. And then in a year, theoretically, a person can make, in 12 months, a person will be able to make that same amount of money. That just seems unsustainable, because as you take that money out of the economy, a person with $100 billion is not going to spend $100 billion in the economy on themselves, because maybe after the first 2 or 3 billion, what's left to buy?
Yes. And this is where the ignorance of the country comes into play, where they talk amongst themselves so that these politicians can get up and say, well, the economy's doing well and we did this, we did. When most people don't even understand what the economy is. It's not the stock market, as we know on this call. It's money in motion. And if people who don't have money can't spend it, then that's the blow to the economy. But we don't educate people that is the choice. For the first time, and I know why, yesterday I saw the debt clock is back. Now that there's a Democratic president, now we're talking about the national debt again. And people don't know the difference between a national debt and a deficit. So if we start to educate people, those public service announcements, that's why we're going to do public works, why we want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, that would go a long way to getting that critical mass behind some.
Yeah, because money in motion, that's something I learned in business school and when I was a member of various business clubs, is if you give a poor person $1,000, or in this case, a $1,400 check, they're going to go spend it. And the reason why they're going to go spend it is because they have bills to pay that probably haven't been paid or just need to be paid. That money goes back into the economy. That means that stores have to increase their inventory because supply and demand, right? And because stores have to replenish their inventory, they have to have people to sell whatever the inventory is. And of course, people have to manufacture, create the products for the inventory. It has to be delivered, so forth and so on. And because you're hiring more people, they have to get gas for their car. They have to have a car. They have to have clothes, the dry cleaners, lunch. It's just a whole bunch of activity is generated by people having money to spend. And so that money goes back, and that generates the cycle of wealth, right? But when a rich person basically vacuums up money by the billions of dollars and keep it to themselves, because they're just not going to spend billions of dollars. And some people say, well, they create businesses. No, the business is created that's generating the wealth because of the productivity of the worker, which is the citizen. That money is warehoused, it's stockpiled. It's taken out of the economy, it's no longer in motion. It actually is not creating anything. It's not generating jobs. It's not generating opportunity. It is almost like it's dead, just sitting there. But it is having a killing effect on the economy and the upward mobility of American citizens. So that's the poor can stop being poor if the rich are willing to become even richer at a slower rate. And I just think that this is important, because what does it mean now that the rich are become even richer at an even faster rate? What does that mean to us? I'll continue to read. Let us take a look at the size of the problem through the lens of the Negro's status in 1967. When the Constitution was written, a strange formula to determine taxes and representation declared that the Negro was 60% of a person. Today, another curious formula seems to declare he is 50% of a person. Of the good things in life, he has approximately 1/2 of those of whites. Of the bad, he has twice those of whites. Now keep in mind, this is in 1967. In 2021, the Negro does not have half of whites. The Negro has about 1/5, I think, the last number I've seen, of whites, if not less than that, and has even more of the negative things. And here it goes, 1967. I continue to read. Thus, half of all Negroes live in substandard housing, and Negroes have half of the income of whites. When we turn to the negative experiences of life, the Negro has a double share. There are twice as many unemployed. The rate of infant mortality, widely accepted as an accurate index of general health among Negroes, is double that of whites. That number has also increased. The equation pursues Negroes even into war. There were twice as many Negroes as whites in combat in Vietnam at the beginning of 1967, and twice as many Negro soldiers died in action, 20.6%. in proportion to their numbers in the population. We're never more than 14% of the population. I continue to read. In other spheres, the figures are equally alarming. In elementary schools, Negroes lag 1 to 3 years behind whites, and their segregated schools receive substantially less money per student than do the white schools. 1/20th as many Negroes as whites attend college, and half of these are in ill-equipped Southern institutions. Of employed Negroes, 75% hold menial jobs. 75%. Depressed living standards for Negroes are not simply the consequences of neglect, nor can they be explained by the myth of the Negro's innate incapacities or by the more sophisticated rationalization of his acquired infirmities, family disorganization, poor education, etc. They are a structural part of the economic system in the United States. Certain industries and enterprises are based upon a supply of low-paid, underskilled, and immobile non-white labor. Hand assembly factories, hospitals, service industries, housework, agricultural operations using itinerant labor would suffer economic trauma, if not disaster, with a rise in wage scales. A lot of this is still going on today. Now, there have been improvements in education. We do see more black people, or Negroes as they were described back in 67, getting college education. But a lot of the other disparities have actually gotten worse. I continue to read. Economic discrimination is especially deeply rooted. Oh, I did have one more thing to say. In 1967, he said that 75% of Negroes had menial jobs. Keep in mind that many of those people may have started work getting paid one thing, and if they were lucky enough to retire, when they retired, they didn't retire because they had been elevated in position. Most of them were at the same position that they started out at, and nor did they get an annual increase in salary. Many retired making the same thing that they started out making. Or if they did get a pay raise, it was minuscule compared to what the white community was getting. That's structural. I continue to read. Economic discrimination is especially deeply rooted in the South. In industry after industry, there is a significant differential in wage scales between North and South. The lower scale in the South is directly a consequence of cheap Negro labor, which ironically not only deprives the Negro, but by its presence drives down the wages of the white worker. The New South, while undergoing certain marked changes as a result of industrialization, is adapting to forms of discrimination that keep the Negro in a subordinate role and hold his wage scale close to the bottom. The personal torment of discrimination cannot be measured on a numerical scale, but the grim evidence of it holds on white Americans is revealed in polls that indicate that 88% of them would object if their teenage child dated a Negro. Almost 80% would mind it if a close friend or relative married a Negro, and 50% would not want a Negro as a neighbor. 50%. I want to go back to that 88% number where it says that, let's see, where is it? Oh, it says, the personal torment of discrimination cannot be measured on a numerical scale, but the grim evidence of its hold on white America is revealed in a poll that indicates that 88% of them would object if their teenage child dated a Negro. It just so happens that once marriage between blacks and whites was legalized by the oh gosh darn it, Loving's case, and this was in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, only about 12% of black people married outside the race. 12%. 88% of white people said they would not accept their child dating a black child. Well, apparently it's the same for marriage, because that rate is, it tracks pretty close to that. It's changing a little bit today, but up until recent years, it still stayed at that same 12%. And that was of black people marrying outside of the black community or Negro community. In that 12% of blacks who married people other than black people, only about 8% or so married white people. So it's in the single digits. I continue to read. These brief facts disclose the magnitude of the gap between existing realities and the goal of equality. Yet they would be less disturbing if it were not for a greater difficulty. There is not even a common language when the term equality is used. Negro and white have a fundamentally different definition. Same word. Negroes have proceeded from a premise that equality means what it says, and they have taken white Americans at their word when they talked of it as an objective. But most whites in America in 1967, including many persons of goodwill, proceed from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement. A loose. White America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, but in most respects, to retain it. Most of the abrasions between Negroes and white liberals arise from this fact. Notice here, it said white liberals. It didn't say Democrat or Republican, it said white liberals. And in 67, this concept of liberals and conservatives wasn't the same as it is today. White America, I continue to read, white America is uneasy with injustice, and for 10 years, it believed it was righting wrongs. The struggles were often bravely fought by fine people. When's the last time we heard somebody say they're fine people? Maybe fine people on both sides. I continue to read. The conscience of man flamed high in the hours of peril. The days can never be forgotten when the brutalities at Selma caused thousands all over the land to rush to our side, heedless of danger and of differences in race, class, and religion. After the march to Montgomery, there was a delay at the airport, and several thousand demonstrators waited more than 5 hours, crowding together on the seats, the floors, and the stairways of the terminal buildings. As I stood with them and saw white and Negro, nuns and priests, ministers and rabbis, labor organizers, lawyers, doctors, housemaids, and shop workers brimming with vitality and enjoying a rare comradeship, I knew I was seeing a microcosm of the mankind of the future in this moment of luminous and genuine brotherhood. Remember, this is Dr. King's words here. But these were the best of America, not all of America. Elsewhere, the commitment was shallower, conscience burned only dimly, and when atrocious behavior was curbed, the spirit settled easily into well-padded pockets of complacency. Justice at the deepest level had but few stalwart champions. A good many observers have remarked that if equality could come at once, the Negro would not be ready for it. I submit that the white American is even more unprepared. Would somebody else like to pick up reading from here?
I'll go ahead.
Go ahead, Wada. A good many observers.
Okay. Is that where you left off?
Yep, page 9.
Alex is coming in, everyone.
Hey, what's going on, Alex?
Alex is in.
Welcome.
Hey, sorry.
Hey, hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. We're on
Okay.
page 9. About 2/3 of the page, and it starts out as a good many observers. And Waddell is reading.
Okay. The Negro on a mass scale is working vigorously to overcome his deficiencies and his maladjustments.
Adjustments.
Yep.
Wherever there are job training programs, Negroes are crowding them. Those who are employed are revealing an eagerness for the advancement never before so widespread and persistent. In the average Negro home, a new appreciation of culture is manifest. The circulation of periodicals and books written for Negroes is now in the multi-millions, while a decade ago, it was scarcely past 100. In the schools, more Negro students are demanding courses that lead to college and beyond, refusing to settle for the crude vocational training that limited so many of them in the past. Whites, it must be said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of the racial ignorance. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have so little to learn. The reality of substantial investment to assist Negroes into the 20th century, adjusting to Negro neighborhoods and genuine school integration is still a nightmare for all too many white Americans. White America would have liked to believe that in the past 10 years, a mechanism had somehow been created that needed only orderly and smooth tending for the painless accomplishments of change. Yet, this is precisely what has not been achieved. Every civil rights law is still substantially more dishonored than honored. School segregation is still 90% unimplemented across the land, and free exercise of the franchise is the exception rather than the rule in the South. Open occupancy laws theoretically apply to the population centers in embracing tens of millions, but grim ghettos contradict the fine language of legislation. Despite the mandates of law, equal employment still remains a distant dream. Legal structures have in practice proven to be neither structured nor law. The sparse and insufficient collection of statutes is not a structure. It is barely a naked framework. The legislation that is evaded substantially nullified the unenforced democracy is a mockery of law. Significant progress has eventually been barred by the cunning obstruction of segregations. It's been barred by equivocation and retreats of government, the same government that was exalted when it sought political credit for enacting these measures. In this light, we are now able to see why Supreme Court decisions on school desegregation, which we described at the time as historic, have not made history. After 12 years, barely 12% school integration exists in the whole South, and in the Deep South, the figure hardly reached 2%. And even these few schools were in many cases integrated only with a handful of Negroes. The decision indeed mandated a profound degree of genuine equality, for the very reason they failed of implementation. They were, in a sense, historical errors from the point of view of the white American.
Waddell, if you could hold on there for a minute, just want to give people a chance to, is anything in there, when we think of, this is back in 1967, roughly. I don't know the number of the integration of schools, but are we really that much more integrated in actual numbers today than we were back then?
Well, the issue there is that this was before the 1974 Milliken case, which separated de facto and de jure segregation. So you have districts that are small. Those school districts related to property rights and related to taxes means that there is, if there is a schools that are of a particular demographic, where there's a majority of a demographic, if it's in a particular structure, there's no responsibility of state intervention, according to that horrible Supreme Court decision. So it's, and that was in Michigan. So you have Detroit, which you can go to schools that are primarily composed of Black students that would look like that some would say look like a segregated school. And then you go to Troy, Michigan, where I went to school, and you might have one or two Black students in the school, in the high school. But there's no responsibility of any type of integration or inclusion of those Black students in the Troy School District, which is which pays teachers higher than any school district in the state. So you have this platinum level school district, and then a school district where you're barely able to have pipes and heat during the winter and air conditioning during the summer months when it's hot and humid. So that's the issue. So really did take, in my view, it took a very, very negative turn. So when people say they want to break up the Clark County School District, there's the problem. Do you want it to look like Michigan, where basically it's all non-Black, non-Latino? So the issue is, and those schools can proclaim diversity because they have Asian students, they have students from Arab nations, students of religious diversity, but no Black students and no Latino students and no Native American students. So that's the nature of the problem, I think, in my view. There was no busing students from Detroit to Rochester Hills, Michigan, because it was determined that if it was based on where people lived and there was no law, no statute that says segregation of schools must occur, then that is permissible. And so I think sometimes we get it, we miss that component in the history of integration. And this book would, and King right here would not have been at that juncture, and it's gotten worse too, as we've seen these other efforts to provide certain career training education academies that are great but don't have access to Black students. Some of the charter school problems, the charter schools seem to be doing quite well in focusing on diversity right now. And Democracy Prep, for instance, has a terrific curriculum, in my view. But so that's so the question: where do we go from here? Chaos or community? People didn't pick community after that decision.
You know, Alex, I'm so glad that you tied those two things together. What was happening then, the Milligan case, and the desire of people to break up the Clark County School District, which is the fifth largest in the nation, because then, and you hit the nail on the head, thank you, there's certain obligations that those smaller districts would have to desegregation. And so when we hear people talk about breaking up the school districts, at least keep in mind that, are they trying to break up the school district because they're truly looking for more personalized education? Or is there something more nefarious at work? Like, oh, by the way, we may not have to uphold certain standards of education desegregation that we would have if we maintained a larger school district. I hope that those who are listening to this connect the dots on this as well. If nobody else has anything, Waddell, you want to continue, or does somebody else want to pick up where Waddell left off?
There ain't no takers. I will continue to the next section.
Okay.
Even the Supreme Court decided, despite its original courage and integrity, curbed itself only a little over a year after the 1954 landmark cases, and handed down its pupil placement decision, in effect returning to the states the power to determine the tempo of change. This subsequent decision became the keystone in the structure that slowed school desegregation down to a crawl. Thus, America, with segregationist obstructionist and majority indifference, silently nibbled away at a promise of true equality that had come for its time.
Hold on, Waddell. That part about slowly nibbled away, that was the Brown v. Board of Education. Think about the Voting Rights Act that they started the chapter talking about. We're seeing there was a slow erosion of voting rights that over time the pace has picked up, where voter suppression, once they gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, once they gutted it, now we see voter suppression.
Section 5 and Section 4B, yeah.
Section 5 and Section 4B. Now we're seeing the suppression of voting in the South, once again, but not just in the South. It is now metastasized. And we see this going on in Northern Tier and Midwestern states. So without the laws preventing it, and the rationale when they argued this case on why we shouldn't gut it, they says because first of all, they never stopped in attempting to oppress the vote. It was because of the law in Section 5 and 4B that prevented them from doing it. So if you say, well, since it hasn't been done, we can now get rid of the law. The reason why it wasn't done is because there was a law. And once you get rid of the law, it will be done. And so the Supreme Court says, well, we have no evidence of that. Okay, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Wishful thinking. 6 years later, what do we see happening in the South today? We see voter suppression. You cannot even bring water and food to people who are waiting online. And the reason why they're waiting online so long and need food and water is because they limited the places people could go vote. And then they made it so that the lines move so slowly to discourage people from waiting. That's voter suppression. It is getting to be, and especially we don't even know how bad it's going to be with the new laws that were passed just recently in Georgia, other southern states, as well as some Midwestern and northern tier states. Anybody else have any comments on that?
If I remember my numbers correctly, I think it was 11 states less than 24 hours after that cutting of that voter rights had started voting on laws of voter suppression.
And after this recent election,
yes,
we see an explosion of laws to disenfranchise certain voters. And the laws actually targeted the practice of certain voters. Guess who those laws targeted? Black people.
And there's a connection between voting and education. Brown v. Board of Education could have ruled that there's a fundamental right to education under the Constitution, a substantive right. The decision, there is not a fundamental right to education in this country. In the same sense, there are so many restrictions on voting, although in general there is a fundamental right to vote. It seems like with these types of restrictions, it's not a fundamental right to vote. And I think there have been some folks discussing right now a way to put that into place. How can you have 250 pieces of legislation to make it more difficult to vote? Photocopies of your ID, efforts to specifically challenge voters over the years. Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist, when he was a lawyer in Arizona, he initiated what was called Operation Eagle Eye, which would go to the polling places, and he as a lawyer would point out Navajo and Navajo Nation residents and other folks of color as being to challenge their status as voters. This is something that's ingrained in white supremacy, and I think that ultimately, if you have a fundamental right to vote, what does that look like? I think it would be automatic registration. Period. If you're eligible to be registered, you are registered. That would be a starting point. The ability to have absentee ballots would make sense.
Yes, Alex, we don't have all this registration thing in Argentina, so that means that is possible. Like, it's unnecessary.
Yes. And one of the law that
do need to have some sort of ID. You do need to have some sort of ID, but that's it. You don't need to register. You are older than 18 years old. You come with your ID, your driver license, or whatever you have. You're in. You don't need anything else.
Well, no, I don't think you need to have an ID. Voter ID laws are a form of poll tax, and you do not need a voter ID at the moment. You do not need an ID at the moment. Identification costs money. It's $27 or $32.
That's weird because we are a poor country, but everybody has an ID.
No, unfortunately, no. There are a lot of, particularly senior citizens, poor people, homeless individuals, unsheltered individuals, people with significant disabilities who have never initiated an identification, or voter ID laws would require an unexpired ID. So you could be living, say, in a long-term care facility for 5 years. The last ID that you really updated, the last time you updated your ID was 10 years ago, and it's been expired for 2 years. You would not be eligible to vote at that point in terms of if there was a voter ID. And in order to renew that, you got to pay money. That sounds like a poll tax to me.
I think she was saying in Argentina, they don't have all of that. Everybody has an ID, but they don't have the registration. If you have that ID, and everybody does, You just go vote. You don't need to register.
Yes,
and do all
there might be some marginal cases, like Alex says, people who are homeless that they might not have the ID, but it seems like the advantage of eradicating voter fraud, it's like it really compensates like a small number of people who might face that problem, that they don't have an ID. But the thing about registering, it's I see it like a really burden that I can't really quite I don't understand what's the excuse to put that extra requirement to a process that should be fairly easy.
Right. And actually the state of Nevada was sued and put under a consent decree under the VARA, the Vote America Act, and Voter Rights Act, VRA, because people that were visiting the welfare office or the DMV were not being educated about their rights to vote. And that's something that's required under that particular statute. And so they were put under a consent decree, and data is being collected as we speak. And there's somebody who manages the implementation of the consent decree. So we do have a history of that in Nevada, of state entities not following through with that education process. But I think we need to initiate and focus on that fundamental right to vote. And while we're at it, a fundamental right to education too.
Yeah, and the poll tax thing, whether it's in actual monies expended or effort, anything that increases the burden on doing something is a form of oppression. It is a form of suppression. And so what we see with these so-called claims to prevent fraud, well, there is no measurable amount of fraud to prevent. So creating a law to do something that doesn't exist, that puts even more onerous expense or burden on the person who is supposed to have this right, goes against the whole idea of having a right to do this thing, when the fundamental precept of America is self-governance, but then we charge or we put a burden on a person to have that ability to self-governance, is antithetical to the concept of America. So I am one who is not in favor of the whole ID thing, because there is no need for it, and it does create a version of a modern day poll tax. But there are laws that are popping up across the country that are doing it. And I think there's going to have to be another constitutional test. In other words, it's going to have to go back up to the Supreme Court for a resolution. Is this impeding the rights of people to for self-governance? Is it taxation without representation? I think that's going to have to be determined by the courts pretty soon.
Rodney and Alex, so if there is no ID, right, and I know that my neighbor Susan Wallace is going to vote just not early than 4 p.m., then I go to one place.
Gabriella, can you repeat that last part?
And then
it broke up.
I go to another. It broke up, yes. So I'm saying, like, how do you avoid that I impersonate my neighbor Susan Wallace? I know she didn't go to vote yet. I know she's not gonna go until 4 p.m. How do you, without the ID, without the picture on it, how do you eradicate this problem?
First of all, it's not a problem, because that would be somebody committing a felony. So you have criminal statutes, and in the same way that you don't have people going to impersonate somebody for the same way that you can charge somebody for impersonating the neighbor for a whole other host of reasons. This is against the law. It's a federal crime, and the punishments are severe. So that's one thing. And what's the benefit? The benefit is quite low if you go vote in place of your neighbor, right? Because first of all, it's one vote. It may or may not have an influence on the election. And furthermore, you're going to, if you're caught, the penalty is far greater, incredibly far greater than the benefit, which is why this does not happen. The second part is there are checks. You need to provide information regarding the address, and there is a signature check. So you have to sign the name, and the signature has to look exactly like the signature that they have on file. When you register to vote, you have information that's put on file.
Good to know.
So yeah, so there is but it's the same. So why do we have this standard for voting where we think automatically that if somebody doesn't have an ID, that they're going to then have somebody impersonate them to vote? Look at all of the other things that we do in the world where we don't require an ID, yet those are fairly significant decisions that are being made. This is a fundamental right. This is the most essential part of being an American citizen. There are other times when we don't have ID is not required. Most purchases in a store, you're not required to have an ID. So we go through transactional items throughout the day. Not to mention the fact that IDs are also fabricated. So if you have an ID, if there is chronic voter fraud going on, and you have an ID law, and you really want to go after these votes, so to speak, then you just would have a fake ID that would be in its place in one way or another if you were doing that one-on-one. But you don't see that. There was a woman who tried to vote twice in Nevada. She was apprehended. There are people that have voted for their dead relatives. They have been caught. There have been people convicted. And guess what? It's probably I can tell you one area where X45 does really well. Dead voters. I think he's got 100% of the dead voters this past election. So because it's always those people that are dead voters, the ones that are dead and the ones that are alive. But the bottom line is this is just not something that's happening. And if it's a fundamental right, do we interfere by putting restrictions on top of the most fundamental aspect of being a citizen? One final thought just on this topic too. Another item that is being taken away from folks in different states, because again, this is state law. So is about harvesting. So taking away the ability, if you live in a skilled nursing facility, somebody taking the ballot to a drop-off place for you, that is being removed in certain states. And then there is another situation where you have people who there are requirements for you to be able to get an absentee ballot. So guess what? All of those requirements are different in each state. So if you have a voter ID law in Texas, but not a voter ID law in New York, then technically the voter in New York has more rights than the voter in Texas. If this is a fundamental American right on a national election, we need national standards. And until we have those national standards, we are going to have an unequal representation. The voters are going to be treated unequally in each individual state.
That's a strong point. I didn't know that it was a state regulation.
Yep, everything is down to the state. So there might be a voter ID law put into effect in Alabama, and here in Nevada, we don't have it. So if you're a voter in Alabama, you would be unduly burdened at a rate be incredibly unfair compared to the fact that somebody's voting in Nevada. So the bottom line is, I could tell you one thing that is a bad bet, and that's ID for voting. That is not a way in which more citizens are able to have access to vote and implement their rights.
And, Alex, it seems like if a country that is, its basic precept is self-governance, then the idea should always be what needs to be done to get more people to participate in the process of self-governance. But it almost seems like there's an effort afoot to do just the opposite. How many barriers can we put in place to prevent people from exercising self-governance? It seems to be totally antithetical to the concept of America, which is self-governing, a self-governing nation. So I think this is interesting to read. This was in 1967, but we see it sort of taking off in 2020 and especially in 2021 after the loss of one party and the ramifications of this. We have history to give us an idea, but it doesn't have to be that way, because even when some of these onerous regulations were put in place in the last election, what we saw was long lines with people sitting for hours, even waiting in the rain. But just like in the 50s and 60s, when they tried to put barriers in place, the people still had such a great desire to exercise self-governance that they still put up with those barriers and exercised their right to vote. And that changed governance. We see a recent example in Georgia where they limited the number of days that you could vote. They limited the number of polling places that you can vote. So you had these real long lines that people stood in line or set for 4+ hours, which is totally unnecessary in this modern era, right? And people bought them food and drink so that they could stay in line through normal eating periods. Well, now some of these same places have passed laws to make it illegal to bring food and drink to people waiting online for these extended periods. And the reason why they're waiting online for these extended periods is because of the onerous, very recent laws put in place. Waddell, we're almost finished with this section, so you wanna continue to read it?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. These are the deepest causes for contemporary abrasions between the races. Loose and easy language about equality, resonant resolution about brotherhood, while pleasantly on the ear. But for the Negro, there is a credibility gap he cannot overlook. He remembers that with each modest advance, the white population promptly raises the argument that the Negro has come far enough. Each step forward accents an ever-present tendency to backlash. This characterization is necessarily general. It would be grossly unfair to omit recognition of a minority of whites who genuinely want authentic equality. Their commitment is real, sincere, and is expressed in 1,000 deeds. But they are balanced at the other end of the pole by the unregenerate segregationists who have declared that democracy is not worth having if it involves equality. Sorry, I don't know why I found that as amusing.
It's because it's obscene.
Yeah, but they are balanced at the other end of the pole by unregenerate segregationists who have declared that democracy is not worth having if it involves equality.
It doesn't seem possible to have one without the other.
Okay, that's what I read. Okay. The segregationist goal is the total reversal of all reforms, establishment of naked oppression, and if need be, a native form of fascism.
Boom!
America, I knew that was going to get you. America has a master race in the antebellum South. Reestablishing it with a resurgent Klan and a totally disenfranchised lower class would realize the dreams of too many extremists on the right. Great majority of Americans are suspended between these opposing attitudes. They are uneasy with injustice, but unwilling yet to pay a significant price to eradicate it. Persistence of racism is in depth, and the drawing awareness that Negro demands will necessarily will necessitate structural change in society have generated a new phase of white resistance in North and South. Based on the cruel judgment that Negroes have come far enough, there is a strong mood to bring the civil rights movement to a halt and reduce it to a crawl. Negro demands that yesterday evoked admission and support,
Admiration
and support, today to many have become tiresome, unwarranted, and a disturbance to the enjoyment of life. Cries of Black Power, or Black Lives Matter, and riots are not the cause of white resistance. They are consequences of it.
Boom. Yes. That's page 12, and that's the end of section 2 of Dr. Martin Luther King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? We started out on page 1 and we ended on the bottom of page 12, which is where we will pick up next week in the reading club that starts at 5 p.m. on Wednesdays. For those of you who are listening to this recording, please add your comments, not only to what was read, but also to the commentary of the speakers in this session. I want to thank you all out there who are listening. And did we have any closing comments about what we have read tonight? And if you will, if you can relate some of your comments or what we've read tonight to what we see happening in the world today in 2021. And if we have no comments, and I hope those of you who are listening that you do, this is the book. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? It's written in the late 1960s. But a lot of the things that they're talking about are happening again in 2021.